Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm here once again with the next chapter of A. Edward Newton's This Book Collecting Game. This one is called Abuses Stripped and Whipped. Under this caption, which was first employed as a title for a volume of verses by George Wither, I shall deal briefly with two gentlemen whose names have attached themselves to two vices, both, luckily, now disappearing, but which for a century or more exerted enormous influence over the game we play with such enthusiasm. I shall first strip Dr. Bowdler and then proceed to whip Dr. Granger. Tom Bowdler was born near Bath in 1754, and it is his distinction to have discovered that Shakespeare used many words and phrases which were not suited to the polite society of his, Bowdler's, day. He therefore proceeded, in 1818, when he was old enough to know better, to produce what he called the family Shakespeare, in which he modestly says that, while he has added nothing to the original text, he has deleted from it all those words and expressions which cannot with propriety be read aloud in a family. The work had a large sale and exerted an enormous influence. Indeed, we are only now fully escaped it. It was Tom's belief that any word or expression unfit for chaste ears, or eyes even, ought not to be spoken or written or printed, and if printed should be erased. This would make hash of most classics, including the Bible, which indeed, he says, calls imperiously for erasement. And no doubt, had he been spared, he would have answered the call, but the last years of his life were devoted to purifying Gibbon. In a Gibbon's Rome, designed for the use of families and young persons, he reprinted from the original text, but with the careful omission of all passages of an irreligious or immoral tendency. In the preface, he was complacent enough to assert that he felt sure that Gibbon himself would have approved this plan, and that his version would be adopted by all future publishers. His nephew, who saw the book through the press, added a note in which he says that it was his uncle's peculiar happiness to have purified both Shakespeare and Gibbon, that they might no longer raise a blush upon the cheek of a modest innocence, nor plant a pang in the heart of the devout Christian. Had Bowdler lived long enough, he doubtless, after having worked his way through literature, would have taken on the arts and painted over offending pictures and clothed the legs of statues in pantalettes. But let us not laugh too loudly at him. We have only recently lost our own peerless one, William Jennings Bryan, who was a man of the same stripe. It is really amazing in how many different ways men get their thrills or kick out of life. There is, I take it, no reason why a man should not amuse himself by Bowdlerizing a classic for his own amusement. The harm arises from the publication of a text which purports to come from the pen of an author as he wrote it, and which bears upon its title page no suggestion that has been purified to meet the whim of an old woman of either sex. Bowdler's influence lasted for 100 years, and thousands of books have been expurgated to meet the views of his followers. And here we have a reproduction of a title page, Stript and Whipped, or satirical essays, which I assume is what the author here is going to talk about next. In the early editions of Pepe's diary, whole pages of naive naughtiness were omitted. So it was with the letters of James Boswell, until they were taken in hand by Professor Tinker. But today it is regarded as an editor's first duty to secure and publish a corrupt text, if such be the text as the author left it. If this is a pun, as I suspect it is, let the reader make the most of it. The question arises, should certain diaries and letters, John Keats' letters to Fanny Brawn, say, be given to the world? That is another matter, but if published, they should not be expurgated, without letting the reader know, at least by asterisks, where certain words or paragraphs have been foundered, marking the spots by boys, as someone has said, that one may, if necessary, return and dredge for them. Gibbon, when squeamish, which was not often, veiled himself in the obscurity of a learned language. This is unkind to the reader who has not Latin at his command. I know nothing more tantalizing than, right in the middle of a spicy story, to have it terminate in a dead end, as it were. A collateral question also arises. Some time ago, a gentleman by the name of Tinker, not my friend the professor, but another, went to the Morgan Library in New York to see some manuscripts of Lafacio, Hearn, and was informed by Miss Bell Green they had been destroyed several years ago. Mr. Tinker expressed his horror that such an act of vandalism should have been committed. whereupon the librarian explained that the manuscripts were indelicate and casually stated that in that very room she herself had burned a number of Washington's letters. The reader will no doubt remember that Lord Byron's journals and some of his letters were in the same way and for the same reason destroyed by John Murray, his publisher, in the library of his house in Aldermale Street. But to return to the Washington letters, they were smutty too, the librarian said, and as we did not want them to become public and smudge the reputation of the father of his country, we destroyed them. Could you afford to pay the price and then destroy your investment? We could and did, promptly replied Miss Green, whereupon Mr. Tinker vented his indignation upon the suppression of historical data, and declared that all of us have, to a greater or lesser degree, an inherent interest in the slightly salacious. There you have it. To what extent shall salacious curiosity be satisfied? So far as the Washington letters are concerned, it may well be that when Mr. Morgan bought them, he bought them with the idea of preventing their getting into print. But I think, had I been in his place, I should have kept the letters and made them accessible only to scholars, as similar letters of Franklin are. We all know that great men have their weaknesses, their vices perhaps, and when, owing to the general nobility of their character, as in the case of Washington, or to their wisdom and general usefulness, as in the case of Franklin, they have been placed in posterity upon a pedestal, I would not have them toppled therefrom, from that the salacious curiosity of the public be satisfied. In a historic sentence, Commodore Vanderbilt tersely expressed my opinion of the public. Grangerizing is the second abuse to which I should like to call attention. It has been called an art, but I should prefer to call it a crime, in that it consists too frequently in the destruction of many books for the production of one, which, when completed, is likely to prove a white elephant upon one's hands. The Grangerized book takes its name from Dr. James Granger, an 18th century print collector and bibliographer who obtained a vicarage and early retired to independence, obscurity, and content. This suggests a man of wisdom. Politically, he was a Whig, and Dr. Johnson, speaking of him, said, "The dog is a Whig. I do not like much to see a Whig in any dress, but I hate to see one in a parson's gown." Granger is, with his followers, responsible for at least the partial destruction of thousands of books. His fame rests upon a bibliographical history of England, a book I think I have never seen, although it passed through several editions. It was designed by its author to be a sort of thread upon which he could string an endless series of engraved portraits. Up to the appearance of his history in 1769, 5 shillings, it is said, was regarded as a good price for a fine engraved portrait. Immediately upon publication, there was a rush to illustrate the book, and libraries were ransacked and priceless volumes mutilated. A sharp knife, better still, a wet thread, and lo, some book was stripped of a portrait and replaced upon the shelves. The destruction was enormous. To this very day, it is almost impossible to find books of a certain class unmutilated by some follower of the well-meaning clergyman. One contemporary who kept his head during this South Sea bubble of the print room said, "If this gout for print continues, let private owners and public libraries look well to their books, for there will not remain a single unmutilated volume in the kingdom." Engraved portraits rose to many times their original price. Dr. Johnson said of the history, "It is full of curious anecdotes, but might have been better done." The author was a Whig, it will be remembered. Boswell wrote to the lexicographer, "I have, since I saw you, read every word of Granger's bibliographical history. It has entertained me exceedingly, and it was of course a book after Gibbon's own heart, Thomas Fognall of that ilk." It was impossible that so virulent a craze should stop with the history, where it began. It extended to other books. Nothing escaped. It may be of interest to refer to some of the great books which have been Grangerized into a sort of infamous immortality. Gibbon, the librarian of Earl Spencer, tells of a Shakespeare that took 16 years to complete. A Bible, which extended to 45 volumes, valued at 3,000 guineas, brought, when sold at auction, £405. A copy of Clarendon's Rebellion cost £10,000 to illustrate, and a copy of Voltaire was extended to 90 volumes. 12,000 engravings were inserted into it. It is only within our own time that the craze has subsided, having been kept alive by many of the London and New York booksellers, who have found it profitable. Biographies, especially Boswell's Life of Johnson, the memoirs of Count Grammont, with his stories of the unblushing beauties of the court of Charles II, Topographical books and books on the stage lend themselves especially to this treatment, and years may be pleasantly and profitably spent in assembling material for the illustration of one's favorite volume. But the sport should end there unless one is prepared to see a heavy shrinkage, should one for any reason decide to dispose of one's material. I have never seen an extra illustrated book bring much over 10% of its cost. My first impulse when I acquire such a book, and I occasionally do at auction, they go so cheaply, is to resolve it into its component parts, to break it up. But that seems a pity, and I never do. My advice to anyone seeking to extra illustrate a volume is Mr. Punch's advice to one about getting married. Don't. But if you must, then carefully index your material and keep it in a cabinet. The moment the work is complete and bound, it has lost its interest and its value, unless it is your intention to give the work to some public institution. In any case, I insist upon an index. In my time, I have owned several extra illustrated Boswells. I still own one. Originally, it was given in boards to James Boswell, Esquire, Jr., from his affectionate father, the author. At the sale of his effects, it passed into the library of the great Herber, who put his stamp therein, and at his sale it was bought by a Mr. Rod, and from him purchased on January 13th, 1835, by John Murray, Byron's Murray, for £2 10 as his signature and a note record. Murray had it extra illustrated. The 2 volumes were extended to 4, and a printed index made, which occupies a 5th volume. Here, now, is an extra illustrated volume with a provenance, not the article of commerce, such as Goodspeed of Boston produces, a volume which the most fastidious collector need not be ashamed of. Originally, it was a part of the sentimental library of Harry B. Smith. What a collection of books was that assembled by that enlightened collector! The Rosenbachs bought the library en bloc and first offered it for sale, as ill luck would have it, on the day the Lusitania was sunk by the cowardly act of a German submarine. Incidentally, securities sank as suddenly. War seemed imminent, but I felt that such an opportunity would not occur again, and I bought all that I could afford. I think 5 times the price I then paid would not now be high. In the case of the manuscript of Charles Lamb's Dream Children, 10 times would not be regarded as excessive. To return to Dr. Granger, he was a poet as well as a preacher, his most famous production being a blank verse effort called The Sugar Cane. It was read aloud from the manuscript one evening at Sir Joshua Reynolds, in spite of Dr. Johnson's protests. Who could make a poem on a sugar cane, the sage inquired. One might as well write a poem on a parsley bed or a cabbage patch. However, the reading went on until the poet began a verse with the line, "Now, Muse, let's sing of rats." This occasioned much merriment, and rats in the printed version was changed to whiskered vermin. It's hard to kill a good idea. Granger died early, in his 53rd year, insane as some think. Just before his death, he preached a sermon before the Archbishop of Canterbury, which he subsequently printed with this dedication to his congregation. To the inhabitants of the parish of Shiplake who neglect the services of the church and spend the Sabbath in the worst kind of idleness, this plain sermon, which they never heard and probably will never read, is inscribed by their sincere well-wisher and faithful minister, J.G. The right to print it is inalienable. I had just finished writing the above when a letter arrived which I ventured to give practically in its entirety, first ascertaining that its writer is, like myself, a happy man, for I have never found anyone who would dispute Dr. Johnson's saying that the happiest life is that of a man of business, with some literary pursuit for his amusement. My unknown correspondent, Frank C. Deering of Saco, Maine, is a man of affairs, bank president, philanthropist, scientist, collector, and an extra illustrator, obviously my superior. I had never heard of him until his letter arrived, but I look forward to making his acquaintance. I have recently bought a new motor car, and wishing to exercise it, I shall accept his invitation. My excuse for publishing his letter is because it gives the other side of the extra illustrating game, and gives it so succinctly that it cannot but prove interesting and valuable to the reader. And Mr. Deering's letter proves another thing, namely that I argue not for victory, but with an honest desire to enlighten and inform, however mistaken I may be in my judgments. Here is the letter. Some years ago, my daughter presented me with your volume, The Amenities of Book Collecting. On page 57, I found a gentle slam at extra illustrating. I've always felt a little bit sore about that criticism, but in reading your article in the Atlantic Monthly published last December, I found a remark that gave me courage and soothed my wounded feelings. If I were to begin again, I would collect Americana. You may be sure of this. If you had devoted yourself to collecting Americana, you could not write as delightfully as you do. The dry atmosphere of early American history is not conducive to brilliant literary production. This will make that brilliant librarian Randy Adams laugh, but what of that? Just a word about extra illustrating. I've had many gentle reproofs for pursuing what is to me a real pleasure, mainly because those who have chided me have not understood what I have tried to do. It always seemed to me to be a mistake to crowd a volume and make it a museum, rather than what it is intended to be. So, from odd places here and there and everywhere, I gather historical articles, carefully split them, and put them together to make a continuous volume. Now and then I have found an obscure pamphlet, such as one picked up in Nova Scotia some years ago, which had a very clear account of the Acadians. There were some 200 pages, each 6 inches long by 2 1/2 inches wide. This, you see, was a very awkward shape to make into a book. So I carefully split each leaf, mounted it, then inserted some nice wood engravings, each mounted with an India paper background. Completed, the book numbered about 250 pages, size 7 inches by 10, bound in full levant with modest tooling. It had no particular history and never had belonged to any celebrated literary character. I made it myself, so it seemed pardonable to dress it in a nice suit of clothes, because I certainly do love handled crushed levant. An old fellow whose eccentricities I knew and appreciated wrote and published in the local newspaper some years ago the history of Fryeburg, Maine. I am sure most of those newspapers must have long since perished. I split each column of the article, carefully mounted it, inserted a few prints, included one of the old gentleman, and again indulged in full levant. You will note by the enclosed newspaper clipping that 500 volumes are the product of my industry. A large portion of them have been along the same lines I have described. I am sure you will let these pass without condemning them too severely. Of course, I have done Napoleon and Grammont, also others of like nature. I'm sure I never sacrificed good books for the sake of prints, and I have rescued hundreds of the latter from actual loss. Will you pardon too frequent use of the pronoun I? I have always felt grieved over your reference to extra illustrating, and more than once have been tempted to write a word in explanation of the way the work can be done. Instead of being destructive, prove the reverse. Your remarks about keeping rare volumes in their original binding are absolutely right. I never mar the simplicity of my early Americana with either print or autograph. They are kept in either slip or solander cases, and absolutely as the early New Englander handled them. I have no reply to make to Mr. Dearling's letter. Shall I have a reader who does not envy me of its receipt? And that brings us to the end of that chapter. And I will be back on Saturday with the next chapter entitled What to Collect and Why, which has a nice illustration of a sundial here.